So today we're going to talk about how to manage risk in restructuring and redundancy processes. Now, we're in very difficult economic times, unfortunately, at the moment. We're projected to go into recession by some economic forecasters, and we're in a climate where lots of businesses recently have announced large-scale redundancies, particularly some of the larger tech players. And I think when that's sort of married to the cost of living crisis, which everyone's going through at the moment, it really sort of shows the importance of dealing with these processes in an appropriate, sort of reasonable way. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I'm joined here by my colleague Ellie Sargent from the employment team. Ellie, you've done quite a bit of work in this area recently, haven't you? Do you want to tell everyone a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been involved in a number of different redundancies for various clients, and it's been a really mixed bag. So I've advised on some smaller scale redundancy processes where only a handful of employees have been affected, but also some quite large scale processes where whole departments and teams have been affected. And I think regardless of the size of the process, one of the most important things that clients need to bear in mind is that they really have to start planning the process as early as possible. And I suppose on that, Seth, you probably have some advice on what kind of things that clients need to bear in mind when they start planning the process.
Absolutely, Ellie. I mean, I think planning and doing so sort of at an early stage is really important. I mean, I think one of the things that's most important really early on is to understand what the business rationale for the particular process is that you're looking at. There's particular criteria which you need to satisfy to actually establish a redundancy under the statutory regime. So you need to think that through, but you also need to think about what the business priorities actually are and why you're doing it. So that sort of needs to be considered at an early stage. I think also you need to sort of really think through quite carefully what's fair and what's actually going to objectively appear fair, because like lots of employment law, sort of carrying out a redundancy process is generally really about fairness and what's reasonable. So it's really important that those sorts of principles are considered and catered for quite early on in the process.
And I suppose on that, how early do clients need to be thinking about that process?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the timing is actually potentially quite crucial. I know you're going to talk a little bit about collective consultation shortly, but depending on the size of the redundancy process and the numbers of people involved will actually dictate how much time is needed. And generally speaking, the earlier the better. What you've got to be really careful about, though, is that you don't do something which will give an indication that there's been a predetermined outcome, because that can potentially make any process unfair. So one of the most challenging areas is collective consultations. I know you've been involved in some of these recently, Ellie. Can you sort of talk us through some of the steps, what they are, and some of the things you need to be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So collective consultation is triggered when an employer is proposing to make 20 or more employees redundant at a single site within a 90-day period. And once that collective consultation is triggered, the employer has certain requirements that they must follow in order to comply with the legislation on this. So some of those key requirements include the fact that employees must have employee representatives or go through a process of electing employee representatives. And the legislation on that is actually really prescriptive, so employers need to be really careful with making sure that they follow that legislation and the requirements. And once that election process has taken place, the elected representatives should then be given certain information and be consulted about the employees in the redundancy process. So that there are certain time limits in respect of how long that consultation process should take place, and it really depends on how many employees the employer is proposing to make redundant. So that's something employers really need to bear in mind when planning for the redundancy process, to make sure that they are complying with all the different time limits that are in place. And then I suppose finally and importantly, there is a requirement to individually consult with employees who are affected by the redundancy process. So not only have you got this collective consultation requirement, it's also really important to individually consult with employees as well.
I mean, if we stay on the collective process just for the moment, I mean, what happens if you get it wrong?
Yeah, so there are actually really serious consequences if things go wrong and the employer fails to abide by the legislation. So firstly, if they fail to notify the Secretary of State within the required time limits, it's actually a criminal offence and it can lead to an unlimited fine. And in addition to that, employee representatives do have the right to bring proceedings on behalf of employees. So if that award is given, that's potentially a 90-day gross pay per employee, which is pretty substantial if you're looking at a large-scale redundancy process. I suppose on that, Seth, do you have any top tips or anything to add on the collective consultation process?
Yeah, well, I think you've summarised that really well, Ellie. I suppose the other things that I would point out is that there is potentially a defence to failing to collectively consult properly, and that's where an employer shows that they've got exceptional circumstances as to why they couldn't collectively consult, but it's a really difficult defence to rely on. I mean, I think if you are going to consider that, you really need to get proper advice, and there are limited opportunities really to actually rely on that defence. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is that the liability that you mentioned for failing to collectively consult, so the protective award, which can be potentially quite significant in large-scale redundancy processes, that can't be compromised under a settlement agreement. So again, there's a few things there just to watch out for.
As well as all this collective consultation that we've been talking about, it's actually really important to look at individual consultation and what the requirements are there. So it'd be great if you could kind of touch on what's required at an individual consultation level.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Look, obviously collective processes, that's important, but every redundancy you're going to have to consider the individual aspects. So in terms of the sorts of stages that you need to think through, I mean, obviously we've talked about planning a little bit. That's really important because you've got to decide whether you're dealing with a situation where there's a group of people that are doing a particular role and you only need a certain number of them going forward. So that might then require some sort of selection process, or you might be dealing with a situation where you've got a number of roles that are quite unique and you don't need them anymore, and therefore we'd sort of say that was a pool of one, and you might not therefore need selection. So you need to think through quite carefully what your structure is that you're trying to achieve. So that planning stage is important, and then making sure that you've got fair and objective sort of justifications for selecting people, again, is quite critical. So once you've done that aspect of it, I suppose the next stage is consultation. So you are required as an employer to fairly consult with each individual going through a redundancy process. Now, the purpose behind that consultation is all about sort of trying to avoid the redundancy. Now, that sort of goes back to my previous point about how it's really important not to predetermine the outcome at an earlier stage, because you can really be undermining the fairness of that particular situation. So you need to be fairly consulting with the individual, which is likely to involve probably 2 to 3 meetings with the particular individual. So you would go through that process, sort of listen to what they've got to say, consider whether there's any alternatives to the redundancy, and also as part of that process consider whether there's any suitable alternative employment that they might be able to sort of carry out within the organisation. So once you've gone through that process, if you've not been able to sort of find a way of avoiding the redundancy, then you're ultimately going to have to terminate the individual. So that will be sort of considering how you do that under the contract, going through any contract formalities, and also making sure that you deal with any payments that the person's entitled to. That'll be sort of notice pay, accrued holiday, and any statutory redundancy entitlements, and making sure that they're explained to the individual. So there's quite a few steps that you need to go through. So Ellie, based on your recent experience of these processes, have you got any top tips for clients?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that clients should bear in mind when going through this process. I think firstly, business rationale is really key, and we've talked about this a little bit, but it's so important that the client knows their business rationale for starting the redundancy process, because this is ultimately something employees will ask about during the consultation process. And then I think secondly, it's very important that if there's any confusion about the process, or an employee asks a question about the process or something about the business rationale, for example, that it is appropriate to seek legal advice, particularly as a lot of these statutory requirements are quite prescriptive, and it's so important to get it right. And then I suppose lastly is that be prepared to consult. it may be the case that the client thinks that employees will definitely agree to perhaps an enhanced redundancy payment subject to signing a settlement agreement, but actually in reality it can be hard to get these things over the line. So it's really important that clients do consult, or at least prepare to consult, because otherwise they can be in a bit of a jam if they've not made those preparations.
Yeah.
And have you got anything to add to that, Seth?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that, and I would just sort of really hammer home one of the points I made earlier, that it's so important to avoid language which indicates that you've predetermined an outcome, because these processes can end up in unfair dismissal claims, and you can really sort of put yourself on the back foot if you've got language that indicates that you've made a decision before you've gone through that consultation process. So that's the sort of first point I'd say. I suppose the sort of second point is, sort of, we've mentioned it today, collective consultation is a whole different kettle of fish compared to a sort of an individual consultation process. Far more prescriptive statutory regime and much more significant liabilities. So really, really crucial that you get appropriate advice in that area. And then I think finally I would say that the reputational damage of getting these things wrong can actually sometimes be much more significant than the financial damage. So it's really, really crucial that they are done properly, and we are going through a difficult time at the moment. People are struggling sort of financially. So I think that if you do approach these processes in a compassionate, fair and reasonable way, then you're going to give yourself a much better sort of chance of just avoiding that litigation that no one wants to be having. And I'm sure that most sort of businesses do want to do the processes in that way as well. So thanks for joining me today, Ellie. I hope that video was useful and informative to everyone who's watched it. If anyone wants any further information about what we've talked about today or about Wigan in general, please do go to the Wigan website. And obviously, if we can answer any questions about what we've talked about today, then please do let us know.